Adventurers have been known to whisper about the wandering bodega, an aberration of a door that only appears to those in most desperate of need. It offers them salvation for those willing to pay the price.
Hello there. So, story goes, I made these doors when I got bored of grey and brown doors like these. Now in my brain it's turned into some sort of interdimensional cursed shopping channel, which is fun. Let me show you how I made them.
So I'm going to start by grabbing one of my minis and use that to size out my door. 2 inches by 1 inch seemed about right, and I'm going to cut it out with a right angle to get some nice crisp 90-degree edges. I'm using leftover pieces of scrap foam wherever possible because once it's textured and painted you're not going to see any of the imperfections that you start with. Next up, we're going to texture our wood. Now you have a couple of options when you're doing this. Traditionally I've used a wire brush and this gives you results like this. But my foam is a little bit tough and this can lead to sort of breakages, which is fine when you're doing a goblin wall like this, but it won't work so well on sort of a sturdy man-made door. So instead for this, I'm going to do a more fantasy, cartoony style of wood and use a craft knife and a blunt pencil. I divided my door into 4 planks, but yours may vary depending on size and scale. First, run your knife down the foam to create a very shallow cut. You don't want to go all the way through the foam. Then I widened it with my blunt pencil, using more pressure to create the gaps in the planks than the wood grain. When creating the wood grain, you'll want to make undulating lines, so just take your time, get nice smooth curves in there, have them grow closer and further apart to create some nice variety in your wood. So now we're going to make the brick frame that surrounds the doorway. I made a couple of these over a few weeks, but I'm pretty sure you won't find any continuity errors. Lightly trace around your door so you've got a vague idea of how big you need your frame to be. I decided to make my frame about 2.5 inches tall. That left me about ½ an inch for each row of bricks. Now you've got your doorway sized piece of foam, mark out the lines of your bricks. Measure and mark how far in you want every other line of bricks to be. I went with about 7mm just to be awkward. And then colour in the sections you're going to cut out. And it's really for the best to use something with a nice sharp point at this point. So get a nice new blade in your knife and cut out your bricks and your doorway. So to get the brick lines in, we're going to follow the same pattern we did with the wood texture. Just run a shallow line along with your knife, and then use your blunt instrument to make them as deep as you want. You'll want to run the brick texture around the top, the sides, and also the inside of the door frame. Just make sure that you do the front and the back before you do this, because your cuts might not be exactly horizontal. I made this mistake with my first one and I ended up having to put in a really small, thin sliver of brick. This might not necessarily be the end of the world. Stonemasons might have made a mistake when they were constructing this, but for the most part you want things consistent. Now if you're anything like me, this will keep you up at night. That door is far too tightly jammed in that frame to actually be able to open. It just wouldn't work. So, to finally be able to get some sleep, I had to carve out some little grooves around the edges. This is just, well, frankly, it's unnecessary and no sane person should do this. But still, I did. I couldn't get the angles exactly right, but once I was in a good enough position, I just used the flat of the blade to press the foam into shape. Now this is where things get a little bit freeform. There's no right or wrong way to decorate your doors. I just pulled out a load of odds and ends that I had lying around, mushed them all together to see what would work. For example, I'm not sure where the triangle came from, but it was a cool idea and I ran with it. I tested out different lintels, piles of bricks, archways of bricks, until I found what I liked. Initially I was going to add the archway onto the triangular door, but that didn't really work. It had 2 contrasting feels, so I decided to split them up into 2 separate doorways. But for now we'll move on to texturing your foam. Break out your roll of kitchen foil to add your rock texture to your foam. Go for the stronger stuff, your cheap stuff won't make an indent on most foams, and I guess rocks have a pretty good rocky texture. Plus, a small rock will get in all those little corners that a ball of foil can't. And finally, I dragged out all my beads, decided against spoon and leaf, and went with circle. Now I undercut the whole thing with a mixture of PVA glue and black paint, or in this case Mod Podge, which will dry a lot harder than PVA glue. And while the paint's still wet, I'll just go through the wood grooves with something pointy to make sure they're not clogged up with paint. And this was about the point that I realised what I'd created didn't really gel well together. The curved archway and the angular accents on the door just didn't match. It was like mixing Elvish and Dwarven architecture almost. And luckily I was able to come up with some changes quite quickly. So now we're on to painting. My thought process was, I'm sick of grey and brown. Had a nice collection of blues running through to greens that I thought would work really well, and also some sort of salmony sandstone colours that worked really awfully. We won't talk about them. But it's nice to make mistakes so you know for next time. Begin by just putting down a base coat of your darkest colour, and once it's dry we'll start layering on the lighter colours. You might need to water down your paint a little bit just to get in all the details on the wood texture. If you don't get a good coverage, just do 2 thin coats rather than trying to layer on a thick coat that will lose your detail. So in order to create this sort of gradient effect, I've got 4 colours. When looking at the value, they run from dark to light, and each brick's going to have its own gradient using 2 or more of the colours. And as we get higher up the archway, I'm going to use a greater percentage of the brighter colours. I'm not allowing the paint to dry between the different shades so that I can blend the colours together still on the model. You'll see that the bottom layer only had a thin crowning of light blue, whereas the second layer is almost a third light blue, and they'll keep getting a higher percentage as the rows increase. On the 4th layer, you can see I did away with the dark blue entirely and just went for the light blue and the green. Now none of this is cast in stone because you might make different decisions while you're painting. You can always paint over stuff you've done, and it never hurts to experiment. I've actually switched up the light and dark so the dark is at the top here. That's because when this big stone lintel goes back on the top, I want it to cast a sort of shadow. Right, I hope you're ready now because we're going to ruin all the hard work that I just put in by applying a black wash over the entire thing. This shows up all the pop marks and stone texture that we put in with a piece of foil. However, it does destroy a lot of the paintwork that I just spent ages doing. When I worked on the second door, I used a slightly quicker process that I'll show you after this. To bring back your gradients, do the same thing you did before but with a dry brushing technique. So you're dry brushing in those different gradients of colour rather than painting them in this time. Your second option is to apply the base colour and then add your wash. Once the wash is dry, just go straight in with the dry brushing, no base painting needed. This gives a barely recognisable dip in quality for a much bigger time save. Here are the 2 doors side by side, and can you really tell that one took nearly twice as long to paint as the other? Right, we're in the home stretch now. One of the doors I left quite simple, but one I wanted to add a load of extras to. So I went through my box of failures and pulled out some bits and pieces that I could break apart and would make interesting accoutrements to my door. Among my failed 3D prints, found a swinging sign, a box of merchant junk, just a swirly pattern, and a cat with 3 legs. And if a 3-legged cat doesn't fit in with a magical travelling door, then I don't know what will. So now I just glued everything together, 3D printed some door hinges because I've gone mad with power, and painted up all my little extras. The merchant's box functioned as a nice weight to bring the door stability. My other doors have some tiles or bricks at the base, so they stand by themselves. This provided a much more interesting way of achieving that, and I'm very happy with the result. And this is the final product. And I must say, I really didn't expect it to look like this by the end, but I am so happy with the results. So, you made it to the end, and I couldn't be more grateful. Why don't you put down in the comments where the wandering bodega might appear for your players when they're desperate enough. I will be doing a giveaway of a painted set of Adventurers Camp scenery once I reach 500 subscribers. So if you enjoy the content and want to help me get to that landmark, hit subscribe and maybe give it a share. I post pretty regularly on TikTok and Instagram, and if my numbers go in the right direction, then my brain gives me the good chemicals and I can have some serotonin. Anyway, see you next time.